We start in the Middle East, where in the past few minutes the bodies of 4 Israeli hostages have been transferred back to Israel. They include Shiri Bibas and her children Ariel and Kfir. Also being returned is the body of Oded Lifschitz, a veteran journalist and peace activist in his mid-80s. The bodies in coffins were handed over to the Red Cross by Hamas in a stage-managed ceremony in Khan Yunis a short time ago. Meanwhile, Hamas has said it's ready to release all the hostages in one go, including those expected to be freed in phase 2 of the ceasefire agreement. The offer, which would involve more than 60 people, is dependent on a full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza and an agreement for a permanent end to the war. Well, these are live pictures now of Khan Yunis, which is where the ceremony was held a few moments ago, and the crowd starting to disperse there after the Red Cross vehicles set off with the coffins inside them. Well, let's also have a look at the scene in Tel Aviv, which is Hostages Square, which is where the focal point has been for the families of the hostages who are being held in Gaza all this time, and for them a grim day, as it's the first time during this exchange of hostages that these have been bodies rather than people who are alive coming home. Let's speak to our correspondent Sebastian Usher, who's in Jerusalem. So it's a very sombre day for Israel, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, some of the previous handovers we've described as being a bittersweet occasion, where there's been joy at seeing hostages return, all of them alive until now, but also concern over the condition that they've been released in and concern over how they will manage after what they've been through. Today, we have seen nothing of that. We've seen caskets containing 4 of the bodies. Hamas gave a list of who they were. You said in your introduction there, the Bibas family, that's a mother, Shiri, and her 2 young children. Their faces are on the covers of Israeli newspapers today, one of which the headline reads, "The pain, the anger and the sorrow," and those are the emotions that are certainly being felt in Israel. And the 4th, as you said, was Oded Lifschitz, who was a peace activist. His wife yesterday on Israeli TV said that she felt that he'd been betrayed by the Palestinians, that he ended up in a coffin after being held hostage in Gaza. The bodies will now be taken by the Red Cross. They'll be handed over to Israel. There'll be a ceremony where a military rabbi will conduct prayers over their caskets, and then they'll be taken to a hospital in Israel where the the task of the forensic identification will begin. That could take many hours, and until then the Israeli government isn't formally saying and identifying who the bodies are, but as I say, across all of the Israeli media, across the world media, those names are there. And those 2 young children, those 2 boys are really, and the mother, Shiri, of course, are the 2 most potent symbols in Israel and for many people across the world, both of what happened on October the 7th, 2023 in the Hamas-led attacks on Israel, and since then, the ordeal that the hostages who were taken, around 250, into Gaza, those who've been released, those who remain, and those, as we're now seeing, who died.
What has the reaction been, if any, so far to the way this has been carried out? The Red Cross had hoped for what they described as a dignified handover. Tell us a little bit about the way this was handled by Hamas.
Yes, I mean, not only dignified, the Red Cross said, but private, and certainly this wasn't private. As we've seen, this is the 7th such handover now. We saw similar choreography as we've seen before. We've seen the serried ranks of Hamas fighters and other armed factions lined up. We've seen crowds behind them. This is staged in Khan Yunis in a place of devastation. Again, a platform which a Red Cross representative came up and went through the formalities that Hamas has insisted on, of signing papers which are then stamped by a Hamas fighter in a mask. Then the bodies, for the first time in coffins, were released. They were taken by fighters to the white ambulances that were waiting for them. Very much stage managed again, and very much trying to send a message. I think the message this time that Hamas and the other factions are trying to send is to put the blame on the Israeli government, and specifically on the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. There was a black cloth across the main poster that was behind the platform until almost the ceremony began, if one can call it that. It then was pulled away to reveal a caricature of Mr. Netanyahu with blood and accusing him of being the murderer of these 4 hostages. That clearly is something that will cause greater anger and distaste in Israel than even what we've seen so far in the previous handovers, where Israelis were disgusted by what they saw as a propaganda event staged by Hamas. Now that these are coffins, and presumably, although this still has to be 100% made clear when the forensic identification has taken place, of 2 tiny children, will only exacerbate that. It is, a day of sorrow.
Sebastian Usher, thank you very much indeed for your analysis there. Thank you. I want to speak now to Dr. H.A. Hellier, Senior Associate Fellow at the security think tank RUSI. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. So, a fairly grim milestone on this process of exchanging hostages as part of the ceasefire deal. What's your reaction to the way this latest one has been carried out?
Thank you and good morning for having me on your program. I don't think it's terribly surprising that Hamas would use this opportunity to carry out such a spectacle. I think what we have to think about at this stage is what this means then for how the Israeli government proceeds on progressing to phase 2 of the ceasefire. As your viewers will know, there's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. We're coming to the very end of phase 1, and phase 2 is meant to begin fairly soon. Negotiations should have already begun in earnest. They haven't. The Israeli government still hasn't sent a negotiation team with a mandate to negotiate for phase 2. And phase 2 is really where withdrawal of Israeli military forces on the ground in Gaza are withdrawn, and you really get to the stages of ceasefire. Whereas right now, of course, these are pauses. They're intermittent pauses, I might say. You've had more than 100 people killed in Gaza by Israeli forces just over the past few weeks during the ceasefire. So I think we're at a very delicate moment because the ceasefire could indeed fall apart at any time, especially in the next week or so, especially against the background of talk around removing all Palestinians from Gaza for the quote-unquote the Riviera plan that the Trump administration has put forward and which has been quite enthusiastically accepted by the Israelis. So it's a very, very difficult time, a very difficult moment in order to avoid further bloodshed and suffering.
Yes, so it's because we're expecting at the moment 6 living hostages to be exchanged on Saturday. Tell us, so that would theoretically be the end of phase 1, is that right?
Well, no, because I mean you're correct in terms of the hostages on the Israeli side being released. Of course, there are many being held who are Palestinians in Israeli detention, but also the end of phase 1 has to begin with the beginning of phase 2. Otherwise, phase 1 just continues, but without much happening on the ground in terms of Israeli withdrawal. And in order for phase 2 to take place, there needs to be that negotiation process about the details. And we just haven't seen that really begin at all. And again, we've seen signs that the Israeli government doesn't want to move to phase 2. And remember, phase 2 is then followed by phase 3. And phase 3 is all about reconstruction of Gaza. Why would anybody be thinking seriously about reconstruction of Gaza if all Palestinians in Gaza are meant to leave and a Riviera plan is supposed to come into effect? Keeping in mind, the Riviera plan is proposed by the American government, which is supposed to be a mediator and a guarantor of the ceasefire deal. And it's already been accepted by the Israeli government, which is one side in the ceasefire deal. So this is all extremely destabilizing.
And what did you make of, we've heard from Hamas in the last day or so that they seemed to be saying that they would be ready to release all the hostages in one go, including those that were expected to be freed in phase 2. But they've said obviously that would be dependent on the full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. How likely a scenario is that?
I don't think it's likely at all. I think that, frankly, they probably know it's not likely at all, because the Israelis aren't going to commit to a full withdrawal outside of phase 2, and I'm not convinced that they'll do so even in phase 2. What we've seen in the Israeli press over the last couple of weeks are indications that the Israelis intend to actually prolong phase 1, but to prolong phase 1 in a way that combines elements of phase 1 and phase 2. So no withdrawal of Israeli forces on the ground, but more and more hostage releases, perhaps more releases of Palestinians that are being detained. And there are many hundreds, of course, in Israeli detention facilities and jails, but without a withdrawal. So in that regard, continue phase 1 or extend phase 1, but really change phase 1 so that it's no longer phase 1, but not really go into phase 2 either. At that point, frankly, the ceasefire has fallen apart, and we've just come into a new arena where there's less of a war on Gaza, but there's still hostilities. Or we could see the entire thing fall apart, where the Israelis turn around and say, no, we're going back to war. And this has been openly called for by different Israeli politicians, including cabinet ministers, not just over the past few days, but over the entirety of the ceasefire period. You had one cabinet minister leave the cabinet saying, I'll come back when we go back to war. You had one cabinet minister say, I'm staying because I know that at the end of phase 1, we're going to go back to war. And the Israeli press has been awash with these sorts of things over the past month. So it's a very, very difficult moment, a very delicate one, where we could indeed see the entire thing fall apart.
Dr. A.J. Hellyer, thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts on the subject. Thank you.